My guest today is Patrick Vlaskovits. Patrick is the CEO and co-founder of Superpowered, a company that was acquired just last year by Splice. Patrick is also a three-time author, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, Lean Entrepreneur and Hustle, and one of the first books that I've read on and loved on customer development, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I've been following the progress of Superpowered for years. I think it's a really interesting company, really interesting technology. Maybe we can start there. So what was the original idea for the company and how did Superpowered come together?
So the origin of the idea is actually with my co-founder Gabor Santo. Gabor's a Hungarian. He lives near Budapest.
Okay.
My family's Hungarian. I'm American, but my parents are Hungarian. I speak the language, and so every summer, not every summer, but usually every summer, we go back and visit relatives and have fun. And about 7 years ago, Gabor and I were introduced, and by a VC in Hungary. I was sort of between projects. Gabor had been talking to some of these VCs about some of the technology he'd been working on, and then they said, "Look, we know this guy's technically very capable. He needs to have, he's the hacker. We need a hustler." And so Gabor and I met at a Starbucks in Budapest, and then he kind of described to me what he felt or kind of what he sensed. And basically it was that there was a big shift happening in the audio space where all sorts of tools and apps that had been available on laptops, so desktop grade processors, were now moving to mobile.
Okay.
And so this is back in 2013, and I guess the iPhone is about 5 years old at this time.
Yeah, 2007, I think.
Yeah, something like that. And but he said, look, there's still a lot to be. Still, the most of the audio algorithms, most of the audio processing infrastructure was designed for desktop environment. Meaning, the assumption is that there's an x86 processor. There's always power. Ergo, it doesn't need to be that resource efficient. Whereas if you look at the mobile devices, they're all ARM processors, much more resource efficient, and of course, power is always an issue when it comes to mobile devices. And Gabor had basically been experimenting and building with sort of a new way to derive audio algorithms and very computationally intensive audio algorithms for ARM processor, and he had figured out a lot. And so we took his and I also agreed with him that I saw what he was talking about, and we took his vision for creating basically, again, sort of a new paradigm, a new library for audio transformations processing, all the typical audio stuff, and bringing it to ARM. And we generalized a solution that he had come up with, and then brought it to market. And then 7 years later, we were acquired.
That's awesome. So what initially attracted you personally, like in the project? Like what convinced you that this had a potential?
Good question. So, two things. One is Gabor is a really special guy, really talented guy. And when we spoke both Hungarian and English to each other.
Okay.
And then I asked him, where did you learn your English? And he goes, well, I learned it by watching like Friends and like YouTube, because at the time he couldn't afford English lessons. So, but he knew that there was a lot of technical information locked up in English language white papers, like at Stanford and MIT. So he could download them, kind of figure out some of the math on them, but couldn't read them. And so he basically taught himself English so he could download technical papers to get his own technology better. And so that really, I thought that was really compelling in terms of a guy who's a hustler, who's trying to push forward, who doesn't give up. So that I thought that was pretty cool. And I like the fact that we were in a very technical space. I thought that was very interesting, kind of a moat. In retrospect, the one mistake, or we made many mistakes, but one mistake we made, this audio space is a tiny space, really. It's really a small space. And our TAM was really small in a lot of ways. And so one mistake I think we made is not early on, we should have expanded the library to image processing as well, because you can use some of the same algorithms from in audio processing to image processing. We should have done that earlier. We never did that, but we should have done that, and we should have done it earlier. So that I think was a mistake, because our small TAM really limited us in a lot of ways.
You're saying that friends actually taught someone to you to read technical
Exactly.
papers. That's awesome.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So how did you go about figuring out like who specifically the technology would be best for initially, like and what the core value was?
Initially it was actually, so this is a really interesting story. So initially it was, look, better performance in this case, meaning lower latency and less power. What's interesting, that story, like that sort of our marketing positioning and that story, why we think that's important. To be honest with you, for the first 4 years, it didn't really, people saw it, they got it, they're like, oh, cool, I get it. Like, okay, like, but they weren't really thinking about this at the time. So we were actually a little bit too ahead of the market,
Okay.
which is very painful because you meet with customers, they go, cool, they nod, but they don't really sign up. So that's very difficult. But then around year three, 4, 5, I guess year 4, the people started coming to us and going, "Hey, do you guys have like low power, resource efficient technology that runs well on ARM?" And we're like, "Well, yes, we do." And so the gap between where we were and where the market was actually started closing. But initially it was, and then we also figured out that a large part of the value too was that a lot of developers were building cross-platform apps, so deploying apps to Android, iOS, even sometimes Windows, et cetera, et cetera. And if you could build like our value is really about, if you're going to build cross-platform apps and you want one audio code base from which to work, we're a really good choice, because not there's other cross-platform sort of audio engines, but we are cross-platform and we're very performant,
Okay.
which is very rare, right?
Okay.
And so that was a big. And I always, and on sales calls, I always tell people, I said, look, if you're just going to do an iOS app and you don't need anything special, just use the native iOS APIs that are free. You're better off that way. But if you're doing iOS and Android, then like there's certainly value. If you're doing iOS, Android, and anything else, then you should definitely use us. And so being able to, again, not just be cross-platform, but be very highly performant on all those, and especially Android. Android is quite frankly a mess when it comes to audio. That was a big value proposition for us.
But if you're saying like you were ahead of the market, and you guys for the first 3 years, people necessarily like not everybody got it. Like, how did you know? How did you guys know that this was the right positioning or the right way to like the right value to put forth?
We did. I think we were, in some senses, we were wrong. I mean, I'm not sure what we would have done differently, because this is how, if you compared to the current offerings, if you compare us to the current offerings, that was our sort of positioning, is that we were designed for ARM and we were much better. But it's really hard to sell in performance. One thing we learned though is like positioning around Android. Android is like we knew Android was a mess before we got into, as we started selling, but Android is like even worse than we had even imagined.
Okay.
So that part of the position worked well. We actually released a lot of content around Android and audio latency. In fact, one thing that we did that worked really well is we named a problem. So there's this audio latency problem in Android, and a lot of developers felt this problem. So they were trying to make low latency apps, interactive apps, and their bosses would say, "Hey, the latency is not low enough. What's going on here?" And they couldn't figure out why they couldn't make it work on Android. And then we actually investigated. We figured out what was sort of wrong with the Android subsystems, and we wrote this long post about this, like why this is happening, why it's important, how we would fix it, and we called it Android's 10 millisecond problem.
Okay.
And now that phrase, Android's 10 millisecond problem, is now like it's used. Like I've had complete strangers tell me about Android's 10 millisecond problem, and so in terms of like a little marketing trick, if you could find an unfelt or unfulfilled need in a space that your company can help solve, even naming the problem can be a tremendous value, right? Because they feel this like nebulous thing, like, oh, Android has this thing, and you say, no. It's called Android's 10 millisecond problem, and here's why it exists: A, B, C, D, E, right? And here's how to solve it. and I think more and more startups especially should take advantage of the ability to articulate and name a problem their customers have, and build credibility, and quite frankly build revenue that way.
So at the time, like how conscious was that effort, like of trying to name it and trying to like kind of own the
It was conscious. It was definitely conscious because I'm a writer, and so I definitely saw that. There's tons of writers that have done this for other things outside of
yeah,
startups,
yeah,
and so like Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule, and there's a bunch of these little phrases that get associated with writers, right? And naming like it was certainly conscious, and it worked well. It doesn't
okay.
always work, but when it works well.
So in a way, you were kind of selling the problem to some extent, or like at least like putting it in a way that articulating it in a way that people could relate to. Yeah, I know what that is. Like that's the problem, and then you put the solution in relation to the
I mean, that's basically the basis of all storytelling and humor, is that there's some problem that needs to be examined, and so you got to sort of front load it with the problems typically first, and then the solution is after, right? And that's how people tell stories and jokes. And I think successful content marketing is also very similar, where especially for us, where we're doing a lot of low volume searches but very high intent. So if you were Googling Android audio latency, or terms around it, like you should definitely be looking at our stuff, and you
okay,
probably should be on the phone with us, right?
okay, okay.
And does it make sense?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So how did you go about figuring out like how to bring Superpowered to market? Like you have this technology, you know it works, you have an
Yeah.
idea of what the value is. Like how'd you figure out the next step about to
Next step. I mean, I had done a lot of digital marketing before, and I was pretty good at.
yeah.
I mean, next step is sort of natural. SEO and content marketing are very natural next steps, where you have developers searching for solutions, and so building so not content that ranks, but actually again solves problems. So we did quite a bit of that. Is very powerful, and and people would tell us when they get on a sales call, like they're like, "I've read every page on your blog." I'm like, "Oh, good, good." So, and so in fact, one time we outranked Android, like in Google, for like certain terms. I'm not kidding you. I don't know if we still do, but there was a time when we were getting a good amount of traffic on Android related audio terms, and we were getting a lot of links and a lot of people writing about us, and we were outranking Android itself. This is great.
Okay. But so how did you know that content would be the right way to
Because
put
developers
Superpowered?
are they're always googling for answers for stuff. So they're
Okay.
always, whether it's
Okay.
like code snippets or how to think about. I mean, it's just really developers are always looking for answers to their problems, and so especially the more specific, right? Like I remember seeing a startup I helped consult with. They looked at their search, and they figured out that they were getting a lot of traffic on like a very specific error code that only their software is throwing. So it was like, whatever, XYZ 4444554, and they were getting like 1,000 searches a month on that, and it really wasn't leading anywhere. So we told them, like, you should build a page optimized for this search that helps either the developers answer the question or lead them into a funnel, or both, right?
Hmm.
And so same thing for Superpowered. Is SEO and content marketing very strong for us.
To kind of figure out what questions people are asking and then sort of creating landing pages slash content pieces that help drive
Yeah, and
the
so actually, I'll give you one tip for one really good way to. I mean, this is, and I don't know why people don't do this more often. Is in fact, I advised this to a company that was just acquired by a friend of mine. Your support tickets have so much fucking information in them, and if you like take them out, clean them up, you could build just like reams of good content at relatively low cost, because you
okay.
have a question or questions, and then your support person has typically already answered the question, right? And so generally speaking, you can just export it, depersonalize it, make a few tweaks, generalize it a bit, and you have this whole realm of high quality, very specific content that you can basically publish for very low cost as a knowledge base, or even as blog posts. and also understanding, like looking at your support, like if you actually look at your support, like I log in our support every day, and I can basically tell, like another thing I've talked about on sort of marketing lectures is based on the questions asked, I can tell a lot about that person who's asking the question, whether they have budget or they don't have budget, or things that they're not even telling to us. And so I think it's always important to keep your finger on the pulse and support. But early on, if you're the CEO or if you're product, like don't just leave support. Don't just go, okay, there's a support function that's sort of siloed. Like make sure you're in there understanding, what people are asking for and why. And it can be a channel to not only derive, new product features, et cetera, but also to cross sell into. And there's just ton of data there.
Yeah, it's crazy how many people view support as a cost center when, like you said, like there's so much stuff you could do with support content itself.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I mean, like it just takes a little time to build that flow, but 100% that, like, so it is sort of a cost center depending how you're set up, but you definitely should be double downing on it and figuring out what's going on, and do not just let it be like this. Again, this one company that was just acquired that I advised, their support was like complete silo away, like had nothing to do with product engineering, had nothing to do with marketing, had nothing to do with there was just so much good data in there that they could have exploited and used, but they hadn't made up their mind to do that.
Hmm. So, so once you guys figure out like this is the model, so like we're using content to drive people in, and then we're trying to get them to buy to use our SDKs so that they use either cross platform or for one specific. Like, how much focus did you guys put on that specific model itself? Like, how long did you guys remain focused on that opportunity itself before trying to expand uh, expand your TAM as you were talking about?
Yeah, well, so the what was interesting with us is I'll kind of indirectly answer this question. One challenge with us was too is that the competition was the de facto competition. There's a lot of open source stuff that's quote unquote free. It's not actually free because it takes longer to use. It's not nearly as good. Yeah, it's free. You don't pay for it, but most open source stuff out there is like terrible. And I know that's not very, very popular to say. And I'm not saying there isn't good open source software. There certainly is, but most of the open source audio stuff out there is terrible. It's not supported. And so, but you still have this sort of free, thing. So people go, well, so-and-so's free. Why should we pay you? And so you have to kind of walk them through into, well, we are like a going concern. We're living, breathing. We continue to upgrade. We're doing this, and this on the roadmap. We have support. And if you actually did the math, like, yeah, you wouldn't lay out as much cash for the open source stuff, but your time spent trying to figure it out and trying to support it would be, a lot higher. So understanding how to sell there, and then also figuring out pricing, where some people were like, a lot of people were doing these perpetual licenses, and we did actually a few of those in the beginning. We're like, okay, you pay us a few grand and you use it forever. And then it didn't work. It just wasn't working. When you tried a bunch of different things, like, okay, well, can we scale with users? And then people say, hey, you want to do rev shares with us? And none of them really work, to be honest with you. So like the rev share doesn't work because they're not really making, anybody who really kind of offers you rev share typically isn't making money at that point. And then there's this whole audit requirement, and people don't want to do that, and it can be really tough. That didn't really work. The user stuff didn't work because people felt like they were being punished for success. And then so we just had to make a decision to say, look, we're going to do this sort of tiered pricing where it's a fixed price per year. It's annually recurring SaaS. It lets us continue to invest into the software, and any of our clients get the benefit of it, right? And lets us grow the company. And that actually was sort of a minor innovation in it of itself, because the audio processing software was not being sold like that at the time. Most of it was again, there's a lot of open source stuff. There's a lot of perpetual license stuff. And then also we position ourselves as a premium product because that's what we are. And the biggest thing also, I think, is we learn how to identify people. So when I sell, I always look for fit. right? Between
Right.
our
Yeah.
solution, their problem, and their company and their budget. And one thing, and I tell anyone who's doing early stage company, the sooner you figure out who you cannot serve and then learn how to identify them in your funnel and then help them find another solution, the better you are.
Yeah.
Because I call those people the anti-segments. The anti-segments are fucking deadly. They waste your time. They're never happy. You can literally cannot make them happy. It's just a misfit. It's a fundamental misfit. And even if they want your stuff, it doesn't like for example, for us, one of our weaknesses was we didn't have really good documentation. Like we knew we didn't have great documentation. We knew you had to be of a certain level developer to get a lot of value out of us. For us, it was a resource constraint question. It was, well, if you have resources, do we develop more cool software or do we develop documentation? And 99% of the time we said, we're going to do more software, right? And so this is admittedly a weakness. And this is something I would even say on the calls. I'm like, look, our documentation is not great. If you've got a developing team that has heavy documentation requirements, we're probably not a good fit for you, right? It's not that we didn't have any, but we just didn't have any sort of long form narrative type document. And so, early on, we had made the mistake of selling to people who just need a lot of hand holding, and then you give them the hand holding and they still messed up and they just weren't happy. And so now part of the sales process, and this has been going on like this for a while, is, and I think any good salesperson will tell you this, is you identify them, you figure out there's a fit. If there's not a fit, you gently take them out of you push them out and say, hey, I don't think we're a good fit for you. Here's why. I think you should go here, here, and here. And kind of and as gently and diplomatically push them away, because if they get in there, they can make life hell for your team. They give you bad information, not because they want to give you bad information, but just because they're trying to fulfill their own personal needs like anyone else. And so understanding who your anti-segments are, who your segments are, who you can really help, the sooner you can do that, it takes a while, you can have to iterate a while, but the sooner you can do that, the more powerful your growth engine can become.
Well, so into that end, like, how do you differentiate like what should be an anti-segment versus a growth or an expansion opportunity? Like the same thing you could have said, like, we were gonna improve all our
So I'll give you
make it better.
And one example is, like I said, you need to be like a decent developer to use our technology. And that's not like, I'm not just saying this as a bragging point. We knew that we were limiting ourselves because not having documentation. Like we understood this. But at the same time, you had to be like a kind of a competent developer. And it was really tough for beginners. And so identifying people early on, either the way they're asking questions or how they're asking them, and then literally saying, hey, guys, like, we don't think we're a good solution for you. We think that, this competitor over here is a better solution for you. So that's one. Budget as well was another one where we had a lot of people, a lot of really huge companies that and you've heard of, huge companies, massive companies come to us. We closed a number of deals that were very lucrative. That was great too. But we also had these big companies that were like, hey, we're a huge company. We're a monster in this space. Because we're a huge company, we want your stuff free. Maybe we'll let you talk about it. And initially we're like, very flattered. And it's really, it's really flattering when you talk to like, a managing director at one of these big companies. They have a huge, massive budget. And you're like, wow, maybe I can get a deal done. Learning how to say no to those guys too. I'm just saying, like, if you don't have budget for us, that's fine. But you're not getting our stuff for free, because it just doesn't make sense. And sometimes, getting logos does make sense. But for our case, a lot of times they wanted to pull us into these projects, use our technology at scale and have it supported, but like not write us a check. And there's a few companies, I'm not going to name them, but there's a few companies are famous for doing this. Trying to bully young companies into helping them because they're just massive. And it can be very, again, in the moment, you're like, wow, man, if those companies did use us, we would be in 100 million devices overnight, and we could tell people that, and it's a famous device that everybody has in their homes. But it was just we just had to learn how to say no to those people, and that's another thing too. I'd advise as well with any early stage startup, figure out how to say no, and not chase every opportunity. I mean, don't get me wrong. I chased a lot of opportunities. I chased a lot of opportunities, and I don't regret even the ones I didn't get. But sometimes you can, these opportunities will sort of sink you. They're not really opportunities often, right?
So in a sense, you're always refining like what that idea of like the right customers are. That's
100%.
partly what you were mentioning, like support as well. Like that's a good way to kind of understand the patterns as well there. Okay.
100%. And so if you understand those people, you can figure out if you're fit, and you'll see patterns like for example, like one of the things that we say now in sales calls, like there's like these smart hobby guys, Joe in the garage. We're a good fit technically for those guys, but we're not necessarily a good fit when it comes to budget. And I tell them straight up, I say, hey, look, we see these, like a lot of times these are very artsy projects. Like they'll have like one project was like a set of flying drones that were going to fly in unison and play music and do this interactive thing. It was like this awesome robotics project some German team was putting together. They liked our software, but they're like, oh, we have zero budget. I'm like, well, I'm sorry, and it didn't work out, right? And so a lot of times if I sense there's like an artsy techno project, typically we're not typically a good fit for those.
Okay.
Trying to think of what else, but my sort of takeaway though is figure out who you're a fit for, make that fit, sell that fit, provide that value, figure out like the people you aren't, and again, move those people aside and help them find your competitor or another solution or whatever it is.
So it's to get that focus. Yeah.
100%. Like that's you need to have the focus where there's the 3 or 4 segments that you can really you can identify, you can deliver value, they get it, and they know they're getting value, and there's so much noise, and you want to filter that noise out.
Okay. So in that case, like what were the triggers that led you guys to expand from audio to websites and apps to network libraries and to cryptographic libraries? Like when did you get like the inflection point where you're like, okay, so now's the right time, or we should do this?
Well, one thing we saw is that we had been doing when we had people taking our SDK and then integrating it with third-party networking tools like OpenSSL and things like that.
Okay.
And then they had some trouble, and they said, look, we like your stuff. Are you going to OpenSSL? It's not really working. And basically it was pretty simple, sort of adjacent feature where it was, hey, they need to encrypt some media and then they need to send it somewhere. And we actually built some cross-platform networking technology that basically did that, because this was almost directly from user feedback, where people kept saying like, hey, help us do this thing, because otherwise I have to pull in OpenSSL to do this, and it's a big pain in the ass. And that was I think, looking back, pretty apparent pattern pretty soon. The stuff we're doing now is actually a little bit more not speculative, that's not the right word. A little more out there. It's really interesting though, and I think it's gonna be tremendous, is the WebAssembly based audio we're doing. So I don't know how well you know about WebAssembly, but WebAssembly basically is the technology that's being supported by the major browser vendors right now. The idea is that you can compile code to run as if it were on a hardware device, meaning that you can have really interactive, low latency interactions. So whether it's a game, whether it's like a Photoshop tool, whether it's some sort of musical device. Because right now, the reason we use apps is basically there's a better connection between an app and the hardware device than if you went through the browser. WebAssembly, in a sense, is changing that. And if WebAssembly keeps being developed and being supported by the browser vendors, you're going to see a lot of app developers move back to the web. And there's a number of reasons. One, first and foremost, is economic, right? So like, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Fortnite launched on Google Play. Oh, did not launch on Google Play. They launched an Android app, but not on Google Play. And someone asked the CEO of Fortnite, like, oh, why'd you do that? He's like, well, there's 50 million reasons why I did that, right? So and they call it economic efficiency, but basically you make more money, right? So think about if you had a franchise like Photoshop or what have you, or and you had to send 30% or to Apple, right? For every like you'd be looking as soon as you could figure out a way to not do that, you would do that, right?
Yeah, but there was a case this year with Basecamp where like they were complaining about that 30%. They got up to like management at Apple and all that stuff. Yeah,
that may happen for Basecamp because those guys are smart and loud, but that's not going to happen for the average developer.
Oh, for sure. But like there is a problem, like you mentioned.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the WebAssembly stuff is interesting. So we actually built I think the first, maybe only, I don't know, things may have changed, but we were the first real-time time stretching in the browser, which in the audio, so time stretching is actually very computationally intensive audio algorithm. It takes a lot of CPU. And basically, if you like slow down or speed up the tempo of a song, and then you also can do pitch shifting where you maintain the pitch so it doesn't sound weird. Mathematically, it's actually very, very, very difficult and computationally intensive to do. And latency is critical. You have almost no latency.
Okay.
And we've developed it. We brought our technology to the web to do this. And actually, one of the reasons we were acquired is we showed this to the Splice guys. And the Splice guys are like, oh shit, like we thought this was like 3 years away. And so they're building, Splice is building cross-platform products basically, right? They want to be available on every surface there is, right? So with native web, what have you. And then Superpowered technology allows them to do that. It was interesting. We could have probably, I think Gabor told me, he's like, man, we should have launched it even earlier. So but people are licensing it. People are using it. It's still early days. But I think you're going to see more and more people building, I think Google calls them, what do they call them? Progressive web apps or some stuff like that.
Okay.
I think you're going to see more and more of that. What's going to be interesting is what if Safari will continue to support WebAssembly. Right now it does, but if Safari endangers the App Store revenues, then I think you're going to see a situation like what Steve Jobs did to Flash, where they killed Flash on Safari because they said it was because of security, but I think it was because of the interactive features.
Yeah, probably the same thing. They'll find another reason to justify it, right? Yeah. All right, super interesting. So the reason why you guys went with that feature set or those specific feature set for WebAssembly, like, is that because that was one of the best way to showcase the value that you guys provide? Or like, is there another set of criteria you guys were looking at for that?
No, so that's a great question. So we wanted to show that because a big promise of our technology is how efficient it is and how little power it uses. And anybody in the audio algorithm industry understands that time stretching is really hard. So like, unlike reverb or echo, those aren't particularly interesting, and they're not particularly computationally intensive. And then time stretching, like, then you're basically saying, hey, we can do everything related to audio on the web. And when I talk about audio, it should be clear to the audience, it's not, I'm not just talking about like play audio, pause audio, what have you. We're talking about interactive audio, where if you're a DJ, you're listening to the music and then you're changing the music in real time. Or let's say you're playing a musical instrument. If there's a delay, between hearing the instrument or even like a Skype call or a Zoom call we're on right now, if the delay were too high, then it would be hard for you and I to converse.
Oh, for sure,
right?
Yeah.
Right, and that's a common problem when you're on a Skype call and like you're like, hey, blah, 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 and you keep talking over each other because the latency is too high.
Yeah.
So, so lowering that latency latency at least on the client side, like there's not too much that we can do on the network side, right? So right now there's some latency on your computer. There's probably some latency in your earbuds as well. Probably not a lot. There's some network latency, and then there's my computer and the computer latency. And probably the greatest latency right now is in the network. There's nothing that Superpowered can do about the network per se, but we can certainly drive down latency on the client side.
But that's super interesting because like initially that was kind of what you guys saw as the core value, and even like that was like a couple of years ago, like a year ago, what you're talking about. Like, so even there, you're still using that core to figure out like what are the other things we can do.
Well, to be fair, like audio, there's only a few characteristics of audio that people care about. I mean, there's the subjective audio experience of anything. but there's also like it's well understood that audio has to be interactive and low latency, or interactive audio has to be low latency, and then it's sort of like bit depth and things like that. There's only really like a handful of characteristics that are used to describe audio technology in terms of when you give it to a developer, right? So and so like bit depth, I guess power consumption matters to some people. Um, the subjective, like for example, Gabor tuned our time stretcher to have like a musicality to it.
Okay.
That's kind of a subjective thing. Some people might say that's great. Some people might say it doesn't sound good. People actually think our time stretcher sounds really good, but there's a fair degree of subjectivity to that too as well.
Okay. Okay.
So back to the point I'm trying to make is in audio, it's you can't really innovate too much on how it's judged or the parameters, right? In terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
people are always going to look at the same sort of parameters and compare it to their solutions, right?
Yeah.
I guess we innovated on pricing. Also, ease of use is another one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's super interesting. Like I used to work at Lander. I think you guys
Yeah.
were involved with them at some point. And we would get like feedback on the mastering, and you would get like the same mastering, same quality. Some people would think it's amazing. Other people would think it's not amazing. And you would get like that gradient, like that gradient of like quality perception to some extent, which is just like what you're mentioning. It's subjective.
Yeah, a lot of it is. And that can be tough. And then learning how to filter that out and proceed is important as well.
Hmm. So you mentioned in an interview, like an interview for many years ago, that a startup is an exercise in resource constraints. I thought that was really interesting, even today. I think that's still probably true. Uh, how do you recommend entrepreneurs factor in their own constraints?
I don't know if I have a good like thought out recommendation, but I think 100% it's an exercise in resource constraints, right? You only have so many hours, you only have so much energy, you only have so many developers, you only have not only you only have so much money, you only have stuff that you're good at, and you just got to figure out how to make progress with what you have. Um, a few years ago, there's a lady, a professor, I think in Virginia. She talked about effectuation,
Yeah,
and that was her big idea. And it was really interesting. Part of it was really interesting is entrepreneurs make do with what they have at hand, right? And I think that's a part of it too. And so in my case, Gabor is like a 100x developer, right? Like I mean, he was like, and I'm not just saying this to exaggerate, or he is like more productive than like 10 dudes put together, and he's obsessed about audio, and he also knows chip design and hardware and audio acoustics and API design. And so a lot of times I would literally go like, okay, well, do we hire someone to write documentation? Do we have Gabor write documentation? Do I try to write some of it? And basically what you kind of come to is like, well, there's only one Gabor, and it's just better if he produces awesome technology super fast, and then we'll figure out the documentation stuff. So like we knew we weren't like perfect, but we had kind of had owned what we couldn't really fix. And again, time and time again, we take a break. Like, man, we really need documentation, and we couldn't find like people. We couldn't find anyone that we trusted at a reasonable rate to write it for us. At the time, I mean, I'm not saying we don't have any, but the big point coming back to research constraints is like it would just be silly for us to have tasked Gabor and our other developers like write a lot of documentation
yeah.
when in the same amount of time we could have improvements on existing features and or what have you, or even build new features.
No, that's a great point.
It's really tough. It's a really tough part of being a CEO or founder.
Yeah, like just making that first determination that this is a competitive edge that we have.
Yep.
We have this super great developer
Yep.
or whatever else, and we're able to do this. Is already something people don't seem to think about doing
Yep.
oftentimes. Yeah. So having been through the highs and lows of startups several times, taught about startup, world books about it, work with a lot of entrepreneurs. Like, what are some of the signs and signals that you feel typically indicate that the need for a pivot or a change of strategy? Sorry, big question.
I mean, like, yeah, man, it's tough. It's tough to think of just really, really like easy ones.
Could be harder ones.
I mean, like I thought, I think we would have done better had we pivoted slightly and gone into image processing.
Okay.
I think we'd have opened up considerably larger market for us. I couldn't convince Gabor. This is also sort of a resource allocation question.
Yeah.
It was tough for me to convince Gabor that would have been a smart move. But I think let me think. This is a tough question. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to see if there's something sort of like generalizable about our experience that would make sense to the listeners of this.
Well, so you mentioned a few times during the interview, like how in hindsight, or you're mentioning it as in hindsight, like having done that would have been better. Like are there kind of negative or instances where you're like, oh, we spent way too much time at that stage, waiting for X or waiting for Y?
Well, one thing we developed a solution for OEMs to basically solve the Android latency problem, and we actually demoed it successfully, but we couldn't convince any of the large OEMs to license it from us. And had I known how tough it would have been to sell into an OEM without a champion, I don't know if I don't know if that was the smartest move. I mean, it was hot. It was a hot topic in the audio in the audio space at the time. We had very large companies, OEMs, come to us and ask for a demo. They wanted to see that we could prove our claim. We actually got down quite a way with a Chinese OEM actually.
Okay.
Until they pivoted radically one day, and then we showed this solution to other OEMs. And we spent a lot of time on not only on the solution, but actually trying to sell the solution, and we couldn't do it. So I don't know if that was a failure I don't know if that was us tilting at windmills, or we just couldn't sell it, or I couldn't sell it. But it was that was one where, looking back, I was like, well, maybe we shouldn't have wasted time with this.
Yeah, because that kind of fits what you were mentioning before about finding like these anti-segments or
Yeah, exactly,
whatever
exactly,
parameters. Hmm.
exactly.
Is there a way for founders to like kind of like quickly figure out like what those should be?
I think it comes down to the problem. Like I think in the biggest thing when we were selling to these OEMs, especially it was basically a lot of OEMs who are producing inexpensive Android phones. That I'd say at the end of the day, they didn't perceive it to be as a problem like we did.
Okay.
Although one of them, like I said, we got down we got pretty far down the way with them. And I think, so I guess the mistake was not verifying that the pain was really there. Right. That was probably a mistake. But man, like we could have, literally we could have, we demoed technology that would have been relatively easy to implement, and you could have updated like billions of Android phones overnight, and they would be almost real time audio capable, basically making them as capable as like a iOS device. And there's multiple challenges there. One is, do they perceive that to be a problem? Two, if they do, does the team think they can do it themselves? Like we ran into an OEM, they're like, oh, we can do this ourselves in the weekend if we wanted to, which is completely incorrect. And that's common when you're selling to developers.
Yeah,
like, oh, we can do this in the weekend. Like, okay.
Right.
And so that's actually just one of the tough, that's like anyone who's ever sold a development tool knows this. It's tough selling to developers. It's not easy.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of, I don't know if it's arrogance is the right word, but there's a little bit of that like reaction, or like, oh, I could have done that, or like,
yeah,
I could.
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, super interesting. So maybe last question. So maybe more generally as the last question. So how's your perspective on starting businesses evolved over the years? Like, how do you see B2B entrepreneurship evolving moving forward?
How do I see I mean, I think if anything, I appreciate now what people told us before, and I didn't appreciate as much, is like have a big TAM, which is very obvious. This is like basic advice. It's like 101, where people go, hey, make sure your fucking market's big enough. And you go, yeah, whatever. And now you go, now looking back, I'm like, we should have listened a little bit better, right? And I mean, we had a good outcome. Like we did fine. We had a good count. We got acquired. It was good. Everything's fine. But just having enough surface area to and have enough shots on goal, having more shots on goal, I think would have been better. And I think we could have grown faster and been more successful. But c'est la vie.
Yeah, for sure. But like, is there a way to look at it a little bit differently, where you could say like, maybe this was your beachhead market, like your entry point was that market, or like?
Yeah, no, for sure, no, 100% too. What I liked about it initially, that it was very niche. So so exactly right though, right? So like what I liked about it is it was so niche, it was easy to identify customers, right? It was relatively easy to identify customers and then market to them in terms of building content, right?
Yeah. Because there's definitely benefits to that, right?
Oh, tremendous. However, the audio is just a weird market too. Like, I don't know if I knew what I knew now, I don't know if I'd ever do like audio is just a really interesting, weird, strange market as well.
Yeah.
It has all sorts of idiosyncrasies, and every industry has idiosyncrasies.
Yeah.
But audio is especially weird and strange.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that really love it are really fanatical about it, and their lives are obsessed with it, and they're great people. But it is very different than like the typical B2B SaaS tool doing accounting or marketing or what have you, right?
Yeah. Because initially, like when I stumbled on maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when I saw what you were working on,
yeah,
I was like, whoa, this is kind of cool. Like my reaction, I wouldn't be a customer of Superpowered, but I was like, oh, this is really cool. Like it's a very focused play, and it's not something that like you have 16,000 companies that are looking into it, like which kind of gives you that headway, that ability to like gain ground on the market, which is great.
True. And on the other side of that, though, is you also have a lot of open source stuff that's not that good, that draws people away, or at least we've had multiple people say, okay, we're going to go do open source. And then they literally, I'm not kidding you, they came back 6 months later. They're like, okay, we wasted 6 months on open source stuff. We found some budget. Like, can we make this work? Right. Yeah. This happened multiple times. And I'm sure it happens in the B2B, generalized B2B world as well.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for taking the time. That's really appreciated. Where can people go to learn more about your work, your company, everything?
Sure. So superpowered.com is still up. Like I said, we're acquired by Splice. You can find me on Twitter at PV. So Patrick Vlaskovits.
Early days.
What's that?
Early day Andal.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I'm on LinkedIn, Patrick Vlaskovits. If you guys if someone wants to send me an email, vlaskovits@gmail.com. Just my last name as it's spelled. So.
I'll add all those links to the post, and thank you for taking the time.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.